Hello and welcome to the Lean In workshop for calling out bias to enable change. I am thrilled to be here with all of you, and I'm happy to see that creating change is so important to so many people. We all know that gender bias hurts women. We know it holds women back in their careers and from excelling at work, and whether intentional or otherwise, bias can make it much harder for women to get hired, get promoted, have access to senior leadership, and in their day-to-day lives. Bias also hurts companies when gender equality and equity come at its expense. And so this is what we're going to focus on today. This workshop is based on Lean In's 50 Ways to Fight Bias program. And what we're going to work through today are specific and solution-oriented scenarios taken from that program. We'll talk about why calling out bias is so important and offer clear tactical actions to take away from the session. And no, the session is not just intended for women. In fact, it was designed to engage men in the conversation. Many gender bias programs can leave men feeling attacked or alienated, but here we want men to be part of the conversation and feel that they play a really meaningful role in calling out and fighting bias. So to the men who have joined today, thank you for leaning in with us. If you're familiar with Lean In, you know that the movement was started in 2013 by Sheryl Sandberg, COO at Facebook. She wrote a book that sparked inspiration amongst women as they navigated their careers, and after the book came the movement. Lean In circles, which are small groups of women coming together to support and empower each other, as well as chapters, started popping up all over the world. These chapters have since grown to include over 44,000 circles in 170 countries. I was fortunate enough to attend the Global Leaders Conference multiple times, held in Palo Alto each year. And this photo from last year includes leaders from all over the globe who came together to share how leaning in matters and is making a difference in their communities. I'm Nicolle White, and I have led the Lean In Toronto chapter as president for 2 years. I've met so many remarkable women who have shared their stories, their challenges, talked with me about the adversity they face often daily in the workplace. How they were passed up for a promotion, were interrupted during a meeting, brushed off as unqualified, or mistaken as junior. And this is why Lean In was started, to build a network of women who support each other to be empowered and achieve success in their careers. Help them find a voice, help them take the seat at the table. And this is why I've dedicated so much of my time to this movement. These stories show me that the work we do really does make a difference, that leaning in matters. So feel free to connect with me and be happy to continue this important conversation with you. Now, getting into our agenda for today, we'll do a brief introduction and then I'll take you through in some detail the different types of bias that women face in the workplace. From there, we'll jump into our scenarios where we'll challenge our own biases and learn ways that everyone can help. After that, each of you will choose your one action that you'll leave here with and commit to doing at work or out in the world. And then finally, we'll leave you with a few more details about how you can continue this conversation through Lean In's 50 Ways to Fight Bias program. So before we get started, I want to walk you through a few reminders. This workshop, of course, is meant to encourage self-reflection as well as have open and respectful conversations. So as we go, I encourage you to engage in the chat and ask questions and comment on the scenarios we're working through, but in a respectful manner. We know that bias is not limited to gender. Women can experience bias because of their race, sexual orientation, religion, and any other aspect of their identity. And the compounding discrimination can be significantly greater than the sum of its parts. This is the concept of intersectionality. So we'll make a note to talk about that a bit later. We also want to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. Remember that everyone's here to learn and do better, and an open and honest exchange is part of that process. So we're not here to make others the enemy or blame anyone. We're here to learn and grow so we can all make change together. Also important to remember that all of us fall into bias traps. People of all genders can consciously or unconsciously make biased comments or behave in ways that might disadvantage women. So I encourage you through this workshop to look inward and challenge yourself to do better. We also recognize that knowing that bias exists is not enough. We need to look for and take steps to counteract it. And that's why the scenarios we'll work through today outline specific examples of gender bias with clear recommendation on what you can do. And finally, the stats, data, anecdotes presented today are all based in research from leading experts on gender, diversity, and inclusion, and in collaboration with gender experts from Stanford University and Paradigm, which is a diversity inclusion strategy consulting firm. This program is also based on findings from Lean In and McKinsey & Co.'s Women in the Workplace study, and every situation has been reviewed by experts to ensure that the program addresses the most common and impactful types of biases women face. And a list of sources can be found on the Lean In website or provided by request. Now let's look at the different types of bias that we're going to talk about today. This workshop covers the 5 most common types that women face in the workplace, as well as addresses the concept of intersectionality. So the first type is performance bias, and this type of bias is based on deep-rooted and also incorrect assumptions about women and men's abilities. We tend to underestimate women's performance and overestimate men's. And as a result, women have to accomplish much more to prove that they're as competent as men. This is why women are often hired based on past accomplishments, meaning they need to prove that they already have the right skills, while men are often hired based on future potential, meaning we assume they already have the skills they need to succeed. Next is attribution bias, and this is closely linked to performance bias. Because we see women as less competent than men, we tend to give them less credit for accomplishments and even blame them more for the mistakes that they make. And we also don't always recognize the work that they do. So even when women and men work together on tasks, women often get less credit for success and more blame for failure. Likability bias is rooted in age-old expectations. We expect men to be assertive, so when they lead, it feels natural. And then we expect women to be kind and communal, so when they assert themselves, we tend to like them less. Likability bias, also known as the likability penalty, surfaces in how we describe women. Women are more likely to be described as too aggressive or bossy, words that are rarely used to describe men in the workplace. Next is maternal bias, and maternity is one of the most common forms of bias that women face. Motherhood triggers false assumptions that women are less committed in their careers or even less competent. And as a result, mothers are often given fewer opportunities and are held to a higher standard than fathers are. Affinity bias is what it sounds like. We tend to gravitate towards people that are more like ourselves in appearance, belief, and background, and we may avoid or even dislike people who are different from us. Affinity bias plays out in several ways in the workplace. For example, mentors might say they're more attracted to proteges who remind them of their younger selves. And bias is not limited to gender. Women can experience bias due to any aspect of their identity. For example, a woman of color might face double discrimination, bias for being a woman and bias for being a person of color. Compared to white women, women of color receive less support from managers, get less access to senior leaders, and are promoted more slowly. And as a result, they are particularly underrepresented in the corporate pipeline compared to white men, white women, and men of color. A similar dynamic holds true for LGBTQ women. Research shows that lesbians have a harder time securing employment than women more broadly. So now that we have a good understanding of the types of biases, let's jump into some scenarios, and we're going to start with a warm-up. So as you're watching this, try to guess the answer and maybe enter it into the chat as well. In a study of performance reviews, what % of women receive negative feedback on their personal style, such as you can sometimes be abrasive, and what % of men receive the same type of feedback? The answer, 66% of women and 1% of men. And we know this to be true. As we heard with likability bias, women tend to be called aggressive, bossy, bitchy even, and as a result, research shows that we receive performance feedback that includes comments on personality. Men, on the other hand, rarely receive similar feedback. Next, how much more likely are women than men to plan on leaving the workforce to focus on family? The answer, actually, there is virtually no difference. Did you guess that women are more likely to leave the workforce? That could be maternal bias coming into play. In actuality, there's virtually no difference between men and women here. What this also shows is that there has been a shift in normative gender roles when it comes to childcare. Next, 1 in 10 senior leaders in your company is a woman. So what percentage of men and what percentage of women think that women are well represented in leadership? The answer, 45% of men and 28% of women. This result surprised me. I thought the gap would be larger. Either way, we all know that 1 in 10 senior leaders is certainly not enough. And finally, what percentage of women have experienced workplace microaggressions? This could include everyday sexism, like being mistaken for someone more junior or having their competence questioned. The answer, 64%. And I personally don't know any women who haven't experienced microaggressions, but that's why we're here today. So let's change that. So we're all warmed up. We know all about the various types of bias. Now let's explore some common scenarios that women face and what we can all do to help. So we're going to work through 6 scenarios that again have been reviewed by gender and diversity experts. And these scenarios, which are based on some of the most common occurrences that women face daily in the workplace, will cover the different types of bias that we just reviewed. So let's dive right in. Scenario 1. A woman suggests an idea in a meeting and it falls flat. A few minutes later, a man suggests the same idea and gets an enthusiastic reaction. Getting credit for ideas is important. It's often how employees get noticed. And when people don't feel heard, they may stop speaking up and sharing their views. And over time, their contributions go unseen. This can slow their advancement. And companies end up missing out on different perspectives and valuable ideas. So what can you do? Remind everyone that the idea originated with your woman colleague. Speak up for her. Say, I think Andrea made that point a few moments ago. Let's discuss it. Advocating for women coworkers in this way can help them get noticed for their contribution, but it can also position you as a leader. As we know, we tend to underestimate women's performance and overestimate men's. We often don't give women as much credit for their ideas. And this is how that type of bias can play out in meetings. The team doesn't hear an idea when a woman raises it, but when a man says the same thing, people pay attention. And this is rooted in attribution bias. This is the trap of thinking women's contributions are less valuable. Another example would be when women are talked over or interrupted in meetings. And one study has shown that men interrupt women nearly 3 times as often as they interrupt other men. And we know that women fall into this exact same pattern. Let's move on to scenario 2. You realize that a colleague who is a man only mentors other men. We know mentorship can be critical to success. And we all benefit when a colleague shows us the ropes or sponsors us for new opportunities, particularly when that colleague is more senior. So if your coworker only mentors men, the women he works with are missing out on his advice and potentially on opportunities to advance. He is also missing out on their best thinking. So what can you do? Talk to your colleague. Explain why mentoring is so valuable and share your observation that he only mentors men. Recommend he mentor at least one woman and offer to help him identify a few candidates. We're often drawn to people with similar backgrounds, as we know, and the problem is that this can disadvantage people who aren't like us. And this is especially true with people who are in positions of power. We also know that some men are anxious about mentoring women for fear of seeming inappropriate. In fact, almost half of men in management are uncomfortable participating in common work activities with women, such as mentorship or working alone together. If a colleague confides in you that he's uncomfortable being alone with women, point out that there are plenty of public spaces to meet and remind him that mentorship of all genders is very important. And we know this is rooted in affinity bias, and this is where people tend to gravitate towards others like them, meaning the women on the team can end up being overlooked or left out. All right, moving on to our next scenario. You're on a hiring committee, and a colleague rules out a woman of color because she's not a good cultural fit. First and foremost, let's call this what it is: racism. We have to move beyond calling this bias. If a person is being judged negatively because of the color of their skin, it's racism. So while this example shows the compounding impacts of bias on women of color, it could also mean the person or organization overlooking that woman for new roles or promotions may have systemic issues around racism that need to be reviewed. So for the purpose of today, let's focus on intersectionality as a whole and the double impact these women face. In business, this is important because companies can and will miss out on hiring exceptional candidates and end up with less diverse teams. And it means that these talented job seekers lose out on opportunities. So what can you do in this situation? If someone rules out a candidate because of fit, ask them to be more specific. If their thinking boils down to she's different, point out that different can be good. Asking for specifics forces people to acknowledge their own bias and prejudice and calls out the behavior as a problem. If culture fit is the reason given, you can propose that this person could add to the team dynamic instead of simply fitting into it. This also promotes the idea and effort of building a truly diverse team. As a longer-term solution, ask that a set of standardized criteria be used for all hires. This reduces bias by minimizing subjective evaluations. And we know this is rooted in double discrimination and intersectionality. So it's critical that we're aware of the different biases, prejudice, or racism that people can experience. And we and our organizations need to commit to fairness and equality for everyone. So let's move on to our next scenario. A colleague recommends a man for a promotion over a woman, saying, "I'm not sure about her long-term commitment. She just got engaged and I think she wants to have kids soon." So why does this matter? Well, when coworkers make assumptions about a woman's commitment to work based on what's happening in her personal life, it unfairly limits her opportunities. And it could also cause your company to miss out on a highly committed candidate. It's also illegal in many places to consider a person's marital or parental status as a factor in hiring or promotions. So what can you do? Suggest to your colleague that the woman should decide for themselves whether or not they want to take on new challenges at work. If you're feeling bold, you can also point out the double standard. It's hard to imagine that we'd say that about a man who recently got engaged. And why does this happen? Well, when women get engaged or married, studies show that they already start to experience maternal bias. People unconsciously or consciously start to question their competence and commitment based on the mistaken belief that women can't be fully present at work if they have family responsibilities at home. And we can all fall into the trap of thinking mothers are not as interested in their jobs and careers and assume that once a woman starts a family, she stops being as committed. For example, some will assume that moms will say no to stretch assignments or business travel or invitations to after-hours work events. And this can make these women feel isolated from the rest of their team. And for companies that care about retaining women, that's a problem and it's important. All right, moving on to our next scenario. A manager describes a woman who reports to her as overly ambitious when she asks for a promotion. When women are criticized for competing for a promotion or stretch assignment, it can have a negative impact on her and on the company. She may miss out on the chance to grow at work, grow in her career, and the women around her might hear this message and think that they shouldn't be asking for promotions. Also, the company might miss out on an opportunity to advance a talented team member and make her feel valued. When women assert themselves, for example, by speaking directly or promoting their ideas or even themselves, they often get a negative reaction. In contrast, men do not. And this discrepancy can have a big impact on women's careers in the long run. So what can you do? Well, prompt your colleague to explain her thinking. Say, generally, I think we like ambition at this company. Why does it bother you in this case? You can also suggest that there may be a double standard at work by saying something like, how do you feel when a man on your team asks for a promotion? This would also be a good opportunity to bring up that you think women at your workplace are often criticized when they seek promotions, if that's the case. And this happens because of stereotypical expectations that women should be selfless and giving, and they face criticism when they appear to be out for themselves. We expect women to be nice and friendly, so when they do assert themselves, this goes against that expectation, and as a result, we like them less. This likability penalty is often evident in words we use to describe women, as we said before, bossy or bitchy, but even demanding or difficult to work with. By contrast, we expect men to be driven and ambitious, and we tend to think well of them and like them more when they show those qualities. So you may have even caught yourself having negative response to women when they show strong leadership or speak in a direct, assertive manner. This is likability bias at work. And as we know, being liked matters. It matters in our careers, and it matters when we're working with other people. And now for our final scenario. In a meeting, a client only looks and speaks to the men on your team. This slight might seem trivial, but it sends a signal about who in the room matters, and in this case, the men. It also creates a dynamic where women miss out on chances to join the conversation, contribute value, and even shape the outcomes. And when this happens, your team isn't putting the best foot forward. So what can you do? Do your part to make eye contact with everyone in the room and find ways to bring women into the conversation. When possible, pass the baton to a woman in a way that highlights her expertise by saying, Candace would be the best person to answer this. She's our resident expert on the topic. And this may happen because of performance bias. Your client may assume consciously or unconsciously that the women at the meeting are less competent or a lower status than the men. Both women and men more readily associate men with leadership. And this bias is so strong that when women do work on teams, their contributions are often less attributed to the team as a whole, whereas in contrast, men work on teams, they're more likely to be seen as taking a leadership role. And if your client is a man, this behavior could also be the result of affinity bias, where people often gravitate towards people like them. So these 6 scenarios only scratch the surface of how bias affects women in the workplace, but I hope you've gained some new insight on how your and others' actions may affect women, and how you can do or say something the next time you witness the various types of bias women face every day. And that leads us to the final part of our workshop, our one action. So the purpose of this workshop overall was to leave you with tactical and tangible actions so you can practice them daily to help fight bias. So we want you to make that commitment. The first step, I want you to think of one thing that you're going to do when you see bias at work, or one thing you've learned today that you're going to go share with others. So take a minute just to think about that. And as you're thinking, I want you to write it down. Commit to it. This is your one action to challenge bias and create change. And if you're feeling comfortable, I'd love for you to share your one action, say it out loud, and share it into the chat box. So what now? Well, you've committed your one action, you've written it down, said it out loud, shared with the group, and we're going to get to those in just a minute. But what else can you do? It's important to take what you've learned here and continue this conversation. Be a champion for women within your organization. Call out bias when you see or hear it. Be an ally to new mothers, women of color, new hires, strong women, soft-spoken women, and all women in general. Acknowledge your own bias and help others do the same. We are all in this together, so let's keep leaning in so we can create that change. And we know the business case for fighting bias is strong. It's been proven that companies with more women in leadership achieve higher profits. So if that's the conversation that will change minds at your company, there are lots of facts and figures to support you. But if you want to go a step further, you can bring the 50 Ways to Fight Bias program into your organization. Lean In has created a full program that's readily available and free to use, and it's available on the leanin.org website. So before we dive into the live portion, I want to thank you, because way too many women face behavior like this and worse every day, because women should not be made to feel insignificant or less than, because women and men need to continue to lean in. And this is why I work extremely hard to ensure women feel like they do have a seat at the table, always, at any level, in any scenario. And I'll continue to work hard and support movements like Lean In until the scenarios we discussed today are distant memories. But we clearly have a long way to go. So let's go. And in closing, I want to leave you with a quote from Sheryl Sandberg. "We cannot change what we are not aware of. And once we are aware, we cannot help but change." Thank you.